All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Hopefully you're here for CA on PA. Hopefully you know what those acronyms mean. It's Cognos Analytics on Planning Analytics, so we're really going to be talking about how to extract maximum value from your Planning Analytics data. As Dustin already mentioned this morning in the keynote, there could be some things referenced in terms of what we think is probably coming down the pipe from IBM. Those things can easily change, but we have regular contact with IBM development team sometimes, so just lets you know if I reference something that I think is coming, may or may not actually happen. So I'm Mike, or Michael Dubois. I'm Services Director and Senior Solutions Architect here at PMsquare. I've been working with Cognos for many years, I think 14 or 15 years at this point. And more recently, I've been working on a number of projects where we've been building out reports and dashboards on top of TM1 and Cognos Planning Analytics data sources. So that's what we're going to be chatting about here today, is how to do that in an effective manner and kind of the ins and outs of it. So here's our agenda, what I plan on covering at kind of a high level. So we're going to start out with just some of the basics about kind of what the architecture looks like and kind of just where you get started with all of this, how you connect to a Planning Analytics data source. Then we're going to start talking about some performance optimizations. That's a topic that has come up frequently with pretty much any customer we've worked with. The expectation when you report on Planning Analytics is that you're going to get very fast response times since you have, of course, aggregates already in memory. That's one of the advantages of the platform. And so when it doesn't deliver to the level that's expected, that, of course, causes problems. We're going to talk about some just general effective reporting patterns that some of those play into performance, but that not necessarily. It might just be certain ways that you can report effectively by tapping into the functionality that's available through Planning Analytics. We're going to hit some limitations that we've run into as well and kind of gained from experience. And then we're just going to briefly talk about the PA side of things. I'm not fully an expert on the Planning Analytics side of things. My expertise is on Cognos Analytics. But there are some lessons learned, and I've talked to some folks in-house who are more experts on the Planning Analytics side, so I wanted to share kind of a few tips from their perspective. All right, so the basics. First of all, when you want to get started, one of the things that, if you haven't done this before, you're probably going to be used to in Cognos, well, I got to create a framework package, or at least now in the Cognos 11 world, I got to create a data module or something before I can actually get started. It's actually really easy to make a connection to Planning Analytics. All you got to do is set up the connection in Cognos. Once you have that configured, the appropriate server designated and such, there could be some complications if you're connecting over SSL, that sort of thing, and that's kind of out of scope with what we're talking about today. But once you're able to get a successful test connection, you right from there within the Cognos portal, you can just publish a package from there, which can include one cube or can include multiple cubes in one package. So that part's super easy. Another basic to understand is just that when you connect to a Planning Analytics data source and start doing reporting off of it, it's going to use what's called the Cognos LOLAP engine. So LOLAP means, the L at the beginning of OLAP is for local. So it's the Cognos local OLAP engine. Essentially what that means is it's going to build a cache on the Cognos side of things. So what you may be expecting is going to happen when you create a report is that there's just going to be kind of direct MDX queries issued to TM1 from Cognos. That's not necessarily the case. When you first go to run a report, it's going to build a cache. There's actually two different types of cache. One's the member cache and one's the data cache. And it's basically going to try to use some intelligence to determine what elements are needed for that report and maybe could be reused, and it's going to load those things up. So that can be very beneficial, but it also can sometimes present some sort of unexpected behavior because you might have some extra time at the outset of running your first report as that cache gets populated, when really what you're thinking is, well, this is a pretty simple MDX query. This shouldn't take long. It may take a few seconds extra or even a bit beyond that to build that cache, particularly if your query isn't structured in a necessarily super efficient manner. It may be loading many more members than are needed into that cache, and that can cause performance problems as well. But you should expect, if you monitor things from the TM1 side, you're going to see many, many tiny requests probably coming to TM1 as that cache gets built. So again, you might expect to see 1 or 2 or 3 MDX queries. If you look in your Cognos report, you might say, hey, I got 3 queries here. That doesn't mean that's going to be what you see coming in on the Planning Analytics side. You're probably going to see lots of little queries to build up that cache. Okay, so Planning Analytics versus TM1 connection type. So you have 2 options, really, when you're going to connect to Planning Analytics, assuming you're using a certain version of Planning Analytics and Cognos Analytics, the reasonably current versions. So the PA connection type uses the Planning Analytics REST interface. It's a more recent introduction. The TM1 connection is the older one that's been in there for a while. But there are some limitations if you use one versus the other. So compatible query mode, CQM, to TM1, it's just not supported in Cognos Analytics at all, first of all. So just you can rule that out entirely. If you're trying to troubleshoot something or test performance and you think we should try CQM, it's not going to work. If you're upgrading from TM1 to Planning Analytics, or you just want to change the connection type from one to the other, it's pretty simple actually. You're just going to add a PA connection, and then you're going to republish your packages. Now you do want to validate that your reports run at that point. There could be a couple gotchas, but overall, any kind of transformation that's needed, changes to the member unique names and such, that should really happen behind the scenes. The main area where that hasn't been the case that we've seen is if you have saved prompt values. Cognos doesn't update those automatically, so you'll need to go in and change those manually, or if you have a tool like Modio, for instance, you can probably do it more in an automated fashion. But Cognos won't automatically do that. So validate your reports, but overall it shouldn't be too big of a deal. When you go from the TM1 connection type to the Planning Analytics connection type, you get some new functionality. So first of all, you get the use of subsets. And subsets are a huge part of Planning Analytics these days. So you want to be able to tap into those. We'll talk more about those later. You get support for Planning Analytics hierarchies as well. Those can be very useful from a reporting standpoint. Can't get those with the TM1 connection type. You also get localized captions. And you really just kind of future orient your setup because all of IBM's new development in terms of connecting from Cognos Analytics to Planning Analytics is assuming that you're going to be using this PA connection type. So if you're using the TM1 type, just don't expect that there's anything new really going to be happening there. You're not going to get the access to subsets or anything through that connection type. Or if you did, that would be very surprising to me. Okay, let's talk about some differences from other OLAP sources. So if you've previously built reports on, let's say, a Cognos Power Cube, or SQL Server Analysis Services, or a Cognos DMR model, you probably have some expectations in terms of how things are going to work. And a lot of things are very similar. You have the same dimensional functions available to you, but there are some things that are kind of different and could throw you. So first of all, if you're working with a TM1 data source, you're not necessarily going to encounter ragged hierarchies, but there's a very good chance you're going to encounter ragged hierarchies just because of how the tool is set up and how the data that's often modeled in TM1 tends to be structured. So don't be thrown by that. You may not have a level designated. You might have more of a parent-child sort of hierarchy. And so that might change a little bit some of the expressions that you create in order to reference those members. You also may encounter multi-root hierarchies, which again, if you kind of come from a transformer, Cognos Power Cube sort of world, this is a new thing. That isn't something that was possible. But in TM1, it's perfectly valid. So if you expand a dimension, you could see that there are multiple top-level members. And so again, that can create some certain challenges, like you might get unexpected results if you try to use root member and you have multiple roots. But overall, it's very workable. It's just something to be aware of, not to be thrown by. You also may need to include certain dimensions in order to see data. I know when I first started working with TM1 data sources, this one threw me because I would drag a measure in, I would drag a dimension, and I would just expect to see something, but I would get empty results quite frequently. So just understand that because of the way this data source works, it's a little bit different than some of these others, you may have to include some certain dimensions, otherwise you might not get data. So talk to your architect or your modeler on the PA side. You sometimes can figure out some trial and error, but you may have to include something from the time dimension, for instance, or a scenario dimension. Otherwise, you might not get any data at all. Okay, so let's start to talk about performance tuning. first of all, I mentioned the cache, and I said briefly how there's this member cache versus the data cache. So the member cache is literally, it's just going to pull in the members of dimensions. So if you have a time dimension, for instance, Cognos is going to look at which members of the time dimension are necessary for your report, or it might even try to make some determination about which members you're going to need to reference if user changes prompt values. I don't know all the ins and outs of that. It's a little bit of a black box. And then it loads those members into a cache. There's also this data cache. The data cache is kind of even more temporary as I understand it. It's literally like the intersections in your report. So some of that might be reused briefly, but if your user changes a prompt value and it only affects certain cells, like that data could be reused. But if you exit one report or dashboard and you go to run another one, it's probably not going to reuse the data cache. It's not going to be able to utilize the data cache at all. However, the member cache, it might be able to be reused. So if you've already loaded members from the time dimension and you go to run another report and you already have your time dimension populated in the cache, then it will just reuse those items. It won't requery them from Planning Analytics, at least for a certain period of time. These caches, of course, expire. There's certain algorithms based on how much memory is available and such through which that's done. But just understanding the difference between those and that those exist can kind of give you a starting point for performance tuning. So this second one here is just kind of a tip that originated out of some troubleshooting that we were doing with the IBM team. So if you have an interactive dashboard that users just click on, and when they click on it, it runs. Okay, so it doesn't have a prompt page. They don't have to specify anything before they get that initial view. We found that these were taking an extra long amount of time to initially run, and there were a number of things that we kind of identified. I'll talk about some more of them. But one of the things that was a real quick win was we found if you just set the prompt values ahead of time, even if those values were blank, that it actually was cutting the initial runtime like pretty much in half. And I'll do my best recollection of the explanation for this. It essentially was, if there are no prompt values available, Cognos goes and asks, like, are there any prompt values, and has to get a response from a service that essentially says no, and then it will kind of re-execute at that point. If you say, here are the prompt values, even if they are empty, it will not do that extra step of reaching out and asking about the prompt values. And so given the way that some of our reports were structured, this was adding on like an extra 10 seconds essentially to the initial runtime of an interactive dashboard, which is pretty substantial. So that's kind of a quick tip that we found through troubleshooting. Additional performance tuning. So get the latest interim fixes. This is for kind of, particularly right now, if you have Cognos 11.1.1 installed and you're trying to do reporting. I've been recently working on a project with a customer who ran into all kinds of performance issues and some kind of functionality issues in terms of referencing Planning Analytics data sources. And we worked with the IBM development team pretty closely, and they've just, to sum it up, they've done a number of things to improve performance. So there's really multiple changes behind the scenes of how queries are generated, how they're processed, that are going to improve performance. I mentioned how there's lots of little queries that often get sent to the database. There still are those to populate the cache, but it went down in one example report we were talking about from something like 3,000 to like 300. So it's not as chatty back and forth. Beyond just basic performance, subsets now act more like normal sets, which I was initially very frustrated when trying to build some of these reports, and I would try to utilize a subset, which theoretically should just be a set that I can utilize any dimensional function with, as I would a normal set, and I would get weird errors. So after some of the changes IBM has made, they now, in every circumstance, or at least almost every circumstance, now act like normal sets. So you're less likely to run into those barriers. So if you're on 11.1.1, basically just open a support ticket and ask IBM for the latest interim fix package. I think it's like 14 or something, but there could be a more recent one. I'm not positive, but I think if you're at least at 14, that it would include these fixes. As of today, I don't think there's an interim fix that includes all performance improvements for 11.1.2 or 11.1.3. I think that's coming out though for 11.1.3 at least within the next week or so, from what I understand. But but this could make a pretty big difference for you. Sir?
So you're saying there's performance improvements that you think are required that were released for 11.1.1 that will be coming out for 11.1.
Yeah, they basically were kind of like in progress working on those while they were also developing 11.1.3, so they didn't make it in the initial 11.1.3 release. So there'll be an interim fix for 11.1.3 that will include some of those. I think some of them are 11.1.3, but not all of them are.
Is this performance just for Planning Analytics cubes or in general for Cognos?
Just for Planning Analytics. Oh, I'm not 100% sure that none of those would provide benefit with other OLAP sources. We're discussing them in the context of Planning Analytics. I wouldn't expect them to affect anything from a relational standpoint, but there's a decent possibility some of them might also just kind of improve, because that low-lap engine that I mentioned, that's used with any dimensional source, not just Planning Analytics. So my guess is that some of those are kind of affecting how the low-lap engine is processing things. So maybe you'd see some benefits with like a Power Cube, for instance, or a Microsoft Analysis Services Cube as well. I'm not sure. Any other questions at this point? Okay, we'll press on. Okay, so also very important in order to achieve optimal performance is to use true dimensional reporting patterns. So if you've been developing reports in Cognos for a long period of time, there's a much greater chance that you've developed on more relational data sources than dimensional ones. Of course, everyone's experience is a little bit different. But I just found from my experience in talking to a lot of Cognos developers, people are generally more comfortable working with relational data sources, at least to do advanced sorts of things. But it's very important if you want to achieve optimal performance that you are really writing efficient OLAP queries. And there's this document that IBM has, which is from 2009, so it's really old. But I've talked recently to the product manager from IBM, and he confirmed that this is still a very relevant document. It still lines up with how the Cognos engine generally processes things, and so this is a great reference document for how to write efficient OLAP queries. And really, if you're trying to transition from a relational style of reporting to dimensional, this is just kind of a decent place to start. So a few things that are kind of included here. You want to filter and slice with member unique names whenever possible rather than attributes. So again, if you're coming from the relational world, there's a number of, you're used to probably just setting up like a detail filter, for instance. If you're working with a dimensional source, you have lots of options. You can create a slicer, you can create a detail filter, you can use a filter dimensional function. If you're using a filter dimensional function, you can feed in attributes to filter on, or you can basically just designate a set and put it in your slicer. And that's kind of what this is getting at here. When possible, don't use a filter function and feed in attributes. Just specifically reference the member unique names. That's going to give you much better performance. There are some, there could be some limitations there. In certain circumstances, you might have to reference an attribute. That might be the only way you can filter based on the way your data is structured. But you also might be able to talk to your modeler on the TM1 side and work with them so that they can kind of evolve the model in a way that you don't have to do that. Perhaps they can give you a subset, for instance. Josh.
If you need to filter on an attribute, now that you have access to subsets, could it be easier to do it on the TM1 side to create a subset?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, in most circumstances, that's what I would recommend is if you have kind of good collaboration going with your TM1 modeler. Generally, creating a subset, it's both, I think I have a slide for this later, but it's both kind of more maintainable. Generally, it's a little closer to the business to create those sorts of sets in TM1 versus creating them in Cognos anyway. Certainly, if you're having to create a filter that's on attributes, you're going to see significant performance improvements by using a subset. So just in general, using dimensional functions is a key part of this. So again, knowing that you have something like a filter function available versus just trying to create a detail filter like you would in a relational style report. Understanding how tuple or tuple, whichever you prefer, how that works. The descendants function. I mean, there's a whole set of them within Cognos. You can browse them. There's a whole area for dimensional functions. But if you're trying to build a dimensional style report and you're not using dimensional functions at all, you're probably not doing it efficiently. You can do a good bit of just kind of drag and drop in, and Cognos will kind of create some sets and such. But you really need to have an understanding of how those dimensional functions work in order to build something that both gets you the best performance that you can get out of the report, and also is more stable as things potentially kind of evolve in the cube a little bit. You want to generally reference things at the highest level possible and not name a bunch of individual member unique names if possible. And use parent members for summaries. This is kind of again, if you're familiar with dimensional style patterns, this one might be somewhat obvious. But on the relational side, if you want to add up several individual elements, you have to basically do a sum of them. Whereas from a dimensional standpoint, oftentimes when you're summing something, it's actually the children of another member. So just to think of it in terms of the time dimension, it's something everybody's familiar with. If rather than sum up 12 months of the year, January through December, just use the year, put the year element in your report, or get the parent element of those months if it's more dynamic, and then use that as your summary. That way, neither on the TM1 side nor on the Cognos side is there an actual calculation having to happen. You're just pulling the actual value itself. These things make sense? Any questions on these items? Sir?
Are you saying use the member unique name rather than an attribute? Does that include caption?
Yeah, caption is a type of attribute, essentially. Yeah.
Making sure.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a great lead-in from the question Josh asked a minute ago. So again, this isn't really so much performance now, some of these things we're going to talk about. They're just effective reporting, I would say, on top of a planning analytics source. So first of all, you want to utilize subsets. This, as I mentioned, puts the logic a little closer to the business. Generally, there's a better chance that your business users are interacting with Planning Analytics in some sort of direct way. So in terms of where you're kind of putting logic, I find that's generally a better place. It's also then reusable across multiple reports. So and again, a subset is it's a set of members. It could be a set of any members within a dimension. So rather than create that set within Cognos, which is super easy to do, there's no problem with doing that. But if you can actually pull it from Planning Analytics, those can actually be dynamic on the Planning Analytics side. And like I said, it's a little closer to the business. So whenever possible, work with your modeler, ask for subsets for whatever makes sense for your business. Again, if we reference the time dimension, maybe there's a certain set of years that are kind of like recent years that you want to actually display. Maybe your business has been around, you have data for 30 years, but you don't want to display that option in your years dropdown. So you could ask for like a current years subset. And that way you don't have to dynamically calculate that in Cognos, you're not maintaining that in Cognos, it's just pulled from that current year's subset in Planning Analytics, and that's maintained there and just flows through to any reports that want to utilize it. Ensure the report time frame is tied to the cube. So basically what I'm getting at here is that rather than try to use some sort of local function in Cognos to calculate your date and then build out a dynamic member unique name from that, that's generally not a really good practice, because the reality is you could end up kind of out of sync with your cube. For instance, your users might know that they only have data loaded up through, let's see, we're in August right now, loaded up through the end of July. And so really when they're thinking of current month in terms of the cube, it should be July. However, we're in August right now, but we're early in August. They're not thinking of the data in that way yet. Again, this can be a use for subsets, is you can have a current month subset, for instance, or you could just have a subset that has multiple months in it, but it could be the most, or the last member in the list, or the first member in the list is the one that you know you need to reference. So that's another great use of subsets, just pull it from there as opposed to trying to calculate it on the report side. As I mentioned, they can mostly be used as regular sets now. I won't promise you that you won't find any gotchas, but the various things that I was trying to do with sets, IBM was able to address, with subsets was able to address, and they were now working as regular sets. One limitation here is that they're not easily browsable within Cognos Analytics. What I mean by that is you can't expand them in the member tree, unfortunately, when you're working with subsets. So you just see a name of a subset. You don't know what's inside it. So what I usually do is I just will open up another report and put like a simple list in it or a simple crosstab. I'll just drag the items there and they go into preview mode in Cognos, and then you can see what's inside the set. It's kind of an annoying little workaround. It probably will be addressed at some point, but it's not really that big of a deal. I don't necessarily need to know everything inside a subset. It's just, if I haven't used that subset before and I'm not sure what's inside it, it'd be nice if I could just click a plus sign and see the members within Cognos, but it's not the way it works right now. Okay, so also for effective reporting, we want to utilize attributes in an appropriate manner. We had a question about the caption attribute. This is just basically a special sort of attribute that dictates what actually gets shown by default in Cognos. It's what's shown in the member tree, and it's what a user sees by default if you don't specify a different attribute to be displayed. So this is pretty easy for your modeler to just say. They can run basically a little process, from what I understand, where basically loads any attribute they designate as the caption attribute. I think they name it as such. And it won't change the underlying member unique name, but it will change what's displayed by default through Cognos. So that's very useful. Keep in mind, especially if there's kind of a new cube that's either being developed or your first time reporting from it, about what you can and can't do with attributes. So you can't use attributes to group by in any sort of effective manner. So I guess I don't have a good example off the top of my head of this, but if you're thinking that something in an attribute you can then put on the side of a crosstab and you can kind of aggregate your values by that, that's not how attributes work. They're really just, they're kind of labels for things. So if you need to do that sort of grouping, that's going to need to be built in. You need to have roll-ups for that, essentially. You can filter by, as we mentioned. It's just generally not the ideal way of doing things, especially if you have very large, a large number of members within your dimension and you try to filter by using attributes. That could impact your performance somewhat significantly. It's fine probably if you're just flagging a few records in the dimension, but as we talked about, probably a good use for a subset instead. Do it outside. Okay. Okay, so dashboard, story, explore, limitations. So the kind of the right off the bat, what I think is a particularly frustrating limitation right now in terms of these tools, particularly dashboards and stories, is you only have what's called the metadata view of data rather than the member view. So really what that means is, I'll use, of course, time again as an example. You can't actually expand years and see the years within the years level. All you can do is essentially drag years or drag the dimension into your dashboard, and then you can filter it from there, which kind of works, but it's not really intuitive for how people expect to work with dimensional data sources. They generally be able to expect to see their members and be able to choose the members they want to include and essentially kind of create their own sets on the fly. You can't do that in dashboards or stories right now. So if you have lots of subsets built out, users can kind of utilize subsets as ways to accomplish a similar sort of thing. But again, they're not browsable within dashboards either right now. So there's just, at the very outset, there's some kind of significant limitations in how you work with dimensional data sources, not just Planning Analytics, but that's just kind of what relevant to what we're discussing here, that make using dashboards difficult. The crosstab object is also very limited right now. Like, you can't drag directly onto the crosstab like you used to be able to do in like Analysis Studio or PowerPlay. You have to kind of drag into a separate drop zone, and you run into other limitations if you start trying to build it out and make it more complex. From what I understand, these limitations are going to be addressed pretty soon within the product. Like I'm hearing this year. So again, don't hold me to that. That could change, but IBM is very aware of this and plans to address them. But at the current time, I'm kind of steering most of my customers away from using dashboards. I've also been hearing a number of reports of performance issues with dashboards in regards to Planning Analytics data sources, and there's just not a lot you can do to tweak or to tune things from dashboard. That's kind of what you see is what you get. There's not a whole lot to change a reporting pattern or something like we've talked about with reporting and do things in a certain way to improve your performance. And then just finally, in terms of Explore, if anybody's is using the exploration tool within Cognos, very, very cool kind of new thing that's in there that I know they're going to continue to expand on. You theoretically can point it to a Planning Analytics data source. I've tried it, and it doesn't seem to do much of anything. You might see some dimensions in there, but as far as kind of drawing those connections between data points and such, and applying some of those statistical things, and pointing out certain things that are statistically relevant, I didn't find any utility in the cubes that I tried pointing it to. So I think that will be remedied probably in the near future as well, but just be aware for now, I wouldn't expect to get much utility out of it. Okay, security considerations. So I'm going to be generous here and say that the way that data security flows from Planning Analytics to Cognos Analytics is interesting. It can be a little bit challenging to code for. There's something called filler members that show up essentially. If a user doesn't have access to a certain member, there'll be kind of a filler member that fills in that gap. The thing that's really frustrating is this actually changes the underlying member unique names for members that might exist underneath it. If you have a combination of multi-root hierarchies and filler members, Cognos doesn't really differentiate between the filler members that it's creating for one root versus the other. And so it all just kind of rolls up into this amorphous mess that's pretty difficult to navigate. So I've had some conversations with the IBM team about this, and they get it. There's just not, the way things are architected, there's not like a clear solution for exactly what they should change to make this easier. The solution that we implemented at a couple customers are using subsets whenever possible. This way you're not trying to write a dimensional expression that will work no matter what security profile the user has. That gets challenging because particularly if you have multi-root hierarchies, you don't even have necessarily a root that you know you can start with. And any other member you might try to reference, that member unique name could change based on the security profile. But using subsets actually is pretty clean. You just reference the subset name, and then dynamically on the Planning Analytics side, you're getting the set of members that a user actually has access to flowing through. And we had pretty good success with this. We just kind of had to identify that was the appropriate solution. So I recommend if you're going to have security applied, you want it to flow through to reports, use subsets rather than trying to code for it within your report. Another limitation, string or text measures. So as of 11.0.7, you can use them in crosstabs. Previously, you could only use them in lists. I've just found that it's not super usable. Performance tends to be pretty poor if you have much data volume at all. If your data volume is very low, it probably won't be a problem, of course, as in anything. But if you have a little bit higher data volumes, performance isn't going to be great. Setting up the queries to retrieve string and text measures is a royal pain in Cognos. You have to basically get the leaves of all, you have to know what all the relevant dimensions are, where the intersection is happening for a particular string or text measure, and then you have to get all the leaf nodes of that dimension in order to actually get results that are meaningful. Generally, you'll just get nothing otherwise, unless you happen to just pull in the exact correct leaf members and find that intersection yourself, which is pretty unlikely. So if anybody actually wants to try to do this, certainly reach out, because I have some actual code that you can put in an expression that will get all the leaf members from a dimension. And once you have all those in, once you know how to do it, it's not terrible, but it's kind of a pain to set up if you're trying to figure out, you don't know exactly where the intersections are, you don't know exactly how to do it in Cognos, and how to do it in a way that's most efficient. Because even that query that gets the leaf members, there's multiple ways to do that, but some of them are less efficient than others. So worked with the IBM team to come up with the most efficient query possible. And performance still wasn't great, but it was usable at that point. So the bottom line is, if possible, I would consider extracting this data and putting it in a relational database for reporting if you have this kind of string or text measure data. I understand that it's not necessarily possible in all scenarios, particularly if you have Cognos Analytics just bundled from a licensing standpoint with Planning Analytics. You can only pull data from Planning Analytics as part of your license agreement with IBM. But if you have the option, or perhaps even that data already existed in a relational source and you loaded it into TM1, I would recommend just going back to the original source or running another extraction process that puts it somewhere for reporting that's relational. Probably you're going to get faster results and your queries are going to be much, much simpler. Okay, reporting over multiple cubes. Just things to keep in mind here. You can't join cubes together. I put here except through convoluted means, because technically you could pull data out of your cube into a data set, and you could use data modules and you could connect those things together. But I consider that very convoluted, because at that point you're losing all the dimensionality of your data. So for a particular use case, you maybe could go that route, but in most cases you want to avoid that. So you might need to, on the planning analytics side, again, create a reporting cube that actually has all the data points that you need. That being said, you can certainly pull from multiple cubes into a report. That's not a problem. You could have one visualization source from one cube, one from another cube. Just be aware you might need to use some, what I said, are fancy expressions in order to convert prompt values for use in multiple cubes. So let's say you have a selection for year. The member unique name for 2019 is going to be different in one cube versus the other cube. And so you'll need to run basically an expression that converts that so that whichever cube is the same as the one in your prompt, you won't have to do anything, but you have to convert that expression for feeding the value to the other cube. Not a big deal, but something to be aware of. Okay, finally, just a few quick notes on the PA side of things. So prepping your cubes for reporting. This is pretty basic, but I've also seen this come up a bunch of times where a cube is created, but the final step of defining the measures dimension isn't done. If the measures dimension is not defined, you're going to run into this right away. You're going to go try to publish a package in Cognos. It's going to let you publish it. You're going to open it up in reporting or in dashboards, and the first message you're going to get is there's a measure dimension not defined for one of the cubes in your package. You could have 10 cubes in the package, won't even let you open it if one of them doesn't have a measures dimension defined. So this is super easy to do. I've even done it in TM1 Architect. You basically just specify what the measures dimension should be. Once it's designated, you won't have that problem in reporting. Adding a top-level consolidation. This kind of takes you away from, in most situations at least, from a multi-root sort of scenario. This is useful from a reporting standpoint. Doesn't necessarily work in all scenarios for all dimensions, but if possible, if it makes sense, add a top level above any children, so you kind of are steering away from the multi-root scenario. That way you can use functions like root member within Cognos. So just if you're on the reporting side of things, talk to your modeler, ask them if that's an option, if it makes sense. If you're on the modeling side of things, it's something to think about for prepping a reporting cube. If it makes sense for your data, add a top-level consolidation. And again, when possible, create balanced hierarchies. You pretty much, as far as I know, you can always create balanced hierarchies for a time dimension. Maybe someone has an exception to that, but generally that's a great scenario. So add your years, quarters, maybe halves if you utilize them, months, etc. And then for other dimensions, just talk about it, whether it makes sense. If they are balanced, then it could make sense to add named hierarchies. That opens up a few other dimensional functions in Cognos reporting, which can make it a little easier to interact with your data. But you don't have to force it. If you truly have a ragged dimension, that's fine. You can still work with it in Cognos. It's not going to be a problem. Create these subsets. Try to think about things, again, if you're on the modeling side, think about things that might be useful for reporting, but probably going to have a conversation with your developer about what actually makes sense. And that could be an iterative process too. As the report development process goes on, they're probably going to reach out and be like, hey, I realized it would be useful to have a subset for this. And they're not difficult to create on the planning analytics side. So just kind of expect that as time goes on, that more and more subsets could be utilized for reporting. And then I'm not going to go really into underfed cubes here, but there's it's kind of a technical concept from the TM1 side. But essentially, if a cube is underfed, you're going to get some unexpected results within Cognos. There's a link here. We'll make these slides available that kind of talks about the ins and outs of that. There's some ways to get around it, but in most cases, a cube being underfed is kind of a problem on the data side that needs to be addressed. So that's usually the best way to address it. But if you talk to your modeler and there's actually a good reason for it, there is kind of a switch you can flip in Cognos so that you'll get valid data even with the cube being underfed. It just will impact your performance negatively. And finally here, just very briefly, so there is reporting you can do just in Planning Analytics without having to go over to Cognos Analytics. Planning Analytics Workspace is kind of more visually oriented. It's a little bit more like the dashboards tool within Cognos Analytics. You got Planning Analytics for Excel or PAX. That really allows you to work within Excel and access TM1 data, some TM1 functions. And there's TM1Web, which essentially allows you to kind of publish some content from Excel and just kind of put it in a web portal. There's a lot more that could be gone into here. I've worked in some of these tools a little bit. I'm definitely not an expert in any of them. But it's just something to consider if you need to get some content out Are there tools on the PA side that could work for you? There could be. Each one of them has limitations, but the real strong suit of each one of them is that they have kind of those write back capabilities, where once you go to Cognos, you're not getting write back. It's truly just for reporting. But you can't do things like bursting, for instance, in Planning Analytics. Those things that you really want to get into operationalizing, it's time to move into Cognos Analytics. If you want to have a minute level of control over exactly how these dashboards are rendered, how they look, how they perform, et cetera, that's where Cognos Analytics is going to excel. Yeah,
Hey, Mike, I wonder if you have any insights in how IBM is thinking of developing out a workspace versus dashboard.
I don't really have insight. There is another session today. I don't know if it's happened yet. And I think there's someone from IBM speaking, and I actually asked him to kind of talk about some of that a little bit, like when to use which tool for what, and kind of the thinking between those two, because I feel like those are the two that have the most clear overlap. And I'm guessing at some point there's going to be less overlap. They're going to be kind of brought together in some sort of meaningful way, but I don't know that for sure. I just know that they're using some of the same like services behind the scenes, the same visualization services to feed them both. But I don't know exactly where they're headed. Other questions? All right. Well, that was easy. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time. Feel free to come up and talk to me if you have any other questions that come up. Thanks.